Okay. How's it going? This is my Tangle tutorial. So firstly, I have this fancy pantsy list of things that I wanted to go over. So firstly what I wanted to go over was hyperloops, air wraps, and ollies. So, I think a lot of it's pretty straightforward, so I guess I'll demonstrate each one first and then explain the differences and how they're useful in different ways. So a hyperloop is going to be one rotation through, entering from one side of your body to the other and exiting on the other side of your body. And each poi goes through the introverted space once. So if you count it, 1, 2, and 1, 2. So notice if I engage on my left side, it's released on my right side. If it's engaged on my right side, it's released on my left side. Okay, so that's just a hyperloop, basically. Next is an air wrap, and this is an air wrap. Oops, sorry. This guy. If you notice, it enters. There's two different types of air wraps that I want to talk about, but I'll get into that in a little bit. So this first one here enters from the outside, and they both get released in this introverted space. So outside, and they both get released on the inside, and they both do one revolution. So 1, 2. 1, 2, and that's the timing for that guy. And then of course there are ollies, or infinite hyperloops. And excuse me, that looks kind of like that. And you go and go and go and go and go. So it's just an infinite hyperloop is all the ollie is. Let's see here. So two different types of air wraps that I really like to play with are the out to in is the first basic one, and then the in to out. So the first basic one that a lot of people use is the out to in. So if you notice, when I'm doing this air wrap here, essentially when I initiate it, I'm starting at kind of an atomic angle like this. It initiates here, they engage, and when it's released, they're oriented in this type of position. So let me go ahead and try to show that to you the best I can here. Okay, so it initiates with an arrow pointing away from me, and when I release, they are at an angle where the arrow is pointing towards me. So, knowing that, you can do the opposite of that, starting with the angle being inwards, and then pushing that air wrap outwards. So that looks kind of like this. Okay, so if you notice, I'm starting from inwards, and then when it initiates through, it ends up being in that outwards. So I'll do it one more time. So it's got a little bit of a different aesthetic, and definitely a different feel. So out to in to out. Out to in to out. Okay? And I guess I can show you on the side here. So out to in to out. Out to in, whoops. Out to in to out. Out to in to out. Okay. So that's that. Ollies. So there's a whole huge system of like plus ones, minus ones, adding knots, subtracting knots, that kinds of stuff. I'm not really going to get too far into that because there's plenty of information out there. However, I do want to make one note about the ollies that will be helpful and kind of distinguishes an ollie between an infinite hyperloop and an ollie. So an infinite hyperloop, I mean, essentially they're the same thing, but when I think infinite hyperloop, I imagine that the poi are, let me do it over here so the lighting is a little bit better. So I imagine that the poi are about split time going all the way through. Okay, so that to me is an infinite hyperloop, whereas an ollie is kind of pulsing. I'm going to try that one more time here. The ollie kind of pulses, and one arm kind of is the driving arm, okay? And if you notice, it's not in split time as much as it is in kind of a third or a quarter time. So that's one of the key things that is going to be helpful, as well as practicing that and keeping that knot in the middle of the tethers. So keeping it nice and close to the middle as opposed to on one side or the other, because if you get too dominant on one side or the other, then it kind of falls apart. Okay, so in terms of the fundamental basics of tangles that I play with the most is a move that I call idling. I've also heard it called stirring the pot. It's essentially an atomic infinite air wrap. Okay, so it looks like this. Okay, and there are many different ways that you can do this. This just happens to be the quote-unquote timing and direction that I'm comfortable with. Of course, with atomics, there is no such thing as timing and direction in relation to each other, but I'm using it in a relative way to kind of help illustrate and describe it. Okay, so basically what it is it is a air wrap, meaning that there is not a knot being made, and one hand is driving in the wall plane in an outwards fashion, or away from, or reverse, if you will, and the other one is engaged and doing the floor-to-ceiling plane and outwards or reverse, however you want to describe it. Okay, so I'll demonstrate it once again. So if you notice, my right hand, this side, is in the wall plane, and my left hand, this side, is in the floor-to-ceiling plane. Okay, and so the reason why I call it stirring the pot, or I've heard it stirring the pot, is if you notice, this hand up here is kind of, you know, stirring a cauldron, essentially. Okay, so you'll see that it is indeed atomic. The reason why this is not a knot is that because I can pull right out of it. Okay, so the difference would be if I were to add a +1 and maintain that, right? This is a +1 doing the same thing, but there is definitely a knot there. And I'll show you from the side again as well. Okay, so this is my working basis. It's definitely a wonky feeling tangle, but once you get comfortable with it, it comes really easy and intuitively, and it's a really good home base for a lot of the tangle movements that I do, including tangle fountains, tracers, tosses, that kinds of stuff. Okay, so using that idle position, or the stirring the pot, I'm just going to call it idling because that's what I'm comfortable with. This is where you can really, because it's atomic, you can turn it into split same pretty easily. You can also bring it into same time butterfly pretty easily, and of course you can do, you know, split time butterfly, that kinds of stuff as well. But being atomic, it's very useful in, you know, breaking out into whatever plane that you decide you want to do. You know, you can go in split same in the floor to ceiling plane as well, or split same in this direction, whatever you want to do. So it's a very useful place to be. So when I say that it's an infinite air wrap in the atomic, of course it does exist in a singular plane to the best of my ability, of course. So this, trying to keep them both in plane, would be an infinite air wrap. Okay. One other distinction that I wanted to make between hyperloops and air wraps is that a hyperloop involves a +1 or a knot. Okay, so if I get to here and I pull out, they are engaged. If I do an air wrap and I pull out, it comes out. So in the same way here, if I'm in an infinite air wrap, right, I can pull out without entangling it, whereas if I do something like an ollie or a hyperloop, if I pull out, it's still engaged. So I'll do that in plane infinite air wrap there. If you notice, my left poi is staying in that introverted space in the wall plane as best as I can, and my right poi is staying on the outside plane, in plane, to the best of my ability. Okay, what else do we got here? Okay, so, oh, one more quick thing from idling. Typically, I use the poi that's in the wall plane as my driving poi, or my leading poi, or the poi that initiates my patterns. Okay, so if I wanted to go into a hyperloop to my right, I would initiate with my right hand, which is this guy, and go through that first. Okay, same vice versa. I would go initiate to the left, but I always drive with the wall plane poi, and that's a personal preference. I just find it a little bit easier. Everybody's different, but that's a good basis to start on. Okay, so going to butterfly stuff real briefly as well. I just wanted to kind of give my 2 cents on the difference between butter flaps and butter floops, because I do believe that there is a fundamental difference, in the same way that there is a difference between hyperloops and air wraps. Okay, so for me, this would be a butter flap. Okay, this is not a butter flute for me because it is not knotted up. There is no knot there. In that, if I pulled out, it comes right out. Whereas if I were to do a full rotation of a butter floop, which would be a butterfly hyperloop, oh, let me try that again. Yeah. I'd be adding +1, -1, and then coming back. Okay. So if I were to stay in a butter floop, butterfly hyperloop, I'd add 1. And this is a butterfly hyperloop. A little hard to maintain, but let me illustrate that once more for you. It comes in, and if I stop it, you can see that there is a knot here. Okay. In that, if I pull my poi apart, they knot together, ideally. So in order to get out of that, if you add 1, you have to subtract 1, which is just done by, putting the opposite poi that you initiated with through that introverted space. So 1, 2, and then back into that butter flap. Okay. I'll show you a side view of that real quick. So 1 in, 1 out, and then back to the butter flap. If I was to stay here, that would be a butter floop continued, same vice versa. Another fun thing with that butterfly hyperloop air gap discrepancy, you can obviously put 1 at a time through, so 1, 2, and you go back to the butter flap. One thing that I found that was a little bit fun is you can push both through that introverted space, and I'm not exactly sure how to describe it. I want to say it's an introverted butter flap, but terminology is not exactly definite, so I'll just show you real quick. Okay, so notice how they both went through that introverted space, and it comes right back into a butter flap. There we go. And I can show you from the side as well. So instead of going 1, 2, so instead of going 1, 2, I would send them both through the inside. Let me try that one more time. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold here. Come on. One more time. There we go. Alright. So that's that. Let's see here. Okay, so one other thing that's going to be really helpful in terms of doing tangles and stuff like that is counting beats, being able to keep track of every revolution of the poi. When they're outside of each other, it's really relatively easy, especially since they're separate. So you can say this is doing 1 beat, 2 beat, 1 beat, 2 beat, if you're spinning same time, split time, all that stuff. However, when you engage in a tangle type of situation, because they are looped together, sometimes it can be hard to keep track of things. So when I first started spinning tangles, I actually had I had the same set of poi, but my tethers were different colored, and that really helped me identify. So utilizing different colors and different poi is really going to help you identify the timing and the beats that are going through. And yeah. So for instance, if you want, obviously, let's start basically for a hyperloop just to illuminate, or to make a quick example. If I were to do 1 and 2, so let's do it. 1, 2, right? An even number is going to bring the hyperloop out cleanly. If I were to do 3, so 1, 2, 3, and let me go back to the other side. So 1, 2, 3, it's not going to be so clean. 1, 2, 3, there we go. And it ends up adding a beat. That's where +1s and -1s come in. But like I said, there's a whole lot of literature on that. But just saying counting beats is really helpful, and something that you should definitely try and practice. Okay, I'm going to go over entry and exit points real quick. So for I feel like essentially what I'm trying to get at is the tangle fountain that I play with a lot, which is essentially just a tangle going from reverse to forwards, or from forwards to reverse, however you want to describe it. But maintaining it and keeping those beats and going through that way. And then you can take this, and put it into a horizontal plane, do a bunch of different tracing and stuff like that as well. So entry and exit points, this is mainly for like hyperloops, but this also applies to straight jackets and stuff like that, and barrel rolls or inversions. So just really quickly, if I'm facing this way, I have 4 distinct, and per direction. So I happen to spin from my perspective, in clockwise, from the observer's perspective, counterclockwise, just what I'm comfortable with. So I have 4 entry and exit points. So I have one entry point in the front on my left side, and in the back on my left side, and in the front on my right side, and the back on my left side. So this way, I guess should show it to you. I'll do it using inversions to kind of give you a better idea of what's happening. So I can initiate a barrel roll on my front left, and it comes out the back. I can also initiate it from the back left, and it comes out the front. Same vice versa on the other side. Front right exits on the back, back right exits on the front. Okay, so in that same way that you can do that with hyperloops. Front right releases back right releases front left releases back left releases front left. Okay, and this is really useful for identifying different types of knots and tangles and stuff like that. This also applies to barrel rolls, like I said, and it's also a very interesting dynamic when you're playing with straightjackets, but I'll get into that in a little bit. Okay, so fountains, okay? This is basically the big thing that I'm trying to get at, and once this gets unlocked, you can really start to play with variations and do tracers, Supermans, this kinds of stuff, and this and that. So basically, my advice would be to get very comfortable with this idling position, or stirring the pot, as I was saying. Basically all a fountain is going from a forward weave to a reverse weave, and in this case we're thinking of a hyperloop or an ollie as a weave. Okay, so if we're going from a forwards hyperloop to a reverse hyperloop, or ollie, however you want to describe it, you just need to be able to count those beats and find that proficiency, okay? So one of the key things that I'm doing, let me make sure this is still recording real quick. Yep, it is, sweet. So one of the main things that's going to be really helpful for me, first of all, you really want to practice keeping those hyperloops and ollies right out in the tethers, okay? You don't want to get too close to one side or the other side because it'll start to fall apart. Keep it nice and even wherever it is at. That just takes practice and drilling and, you know, that kinds of stuff. Basically, I'm sure many of you, or you, have played with orbitals. And a way to get the orbitals to work really nicely is if you pull on the tethers perpendicular to the plane of the spinning poi. So, for instance, going from here, let's try that again, going from here, if you pull in tighter, they go faster and faster, okay? So that's just a fundamental law of physics, you know, the smaller the circle, the faster they're going to spin with the same amount of energy. So when doing ollies and hyperloops and stuff like that, if you utilize that motion very subtly, it can really help you keep the momentum of the poi going without having to, you know, shove and lurch and move it around too much. So I'll just show you a quick example front and to the side of how I utilize it when I'm going through that. So I come through starting in the idle. Let's first say, for instance, I want to go to my right, which will be a forward direction for me. I'm going to let it hit the bottom, and then I'm going to do one quick little tug perpendicular to that plane. And what that does is it helps get that second one that's on the bottom of the floor to ceiling plane into plane, and to do one rotation through. So really practice doing that. So go 1, 2, and then come back. My right hand's always driving in the wall plane. 1, 2. Keep doing that. 1, 2. This is a great drill. And of course you want to do the same thing going the opposite way. And like I said, I'm always driving with my right hand poi, which is the wall plane poi. Once again, that's a personal preference. I'm sure it's possible to do it the other way, but this is one of the more intuitive ways in my opinion. So same thing. 1, 2, back in, 1, 2, back in. Okay, so I'll show you that from the side to kind of emphasize that tugging motion. So notice how right now my hands are pretty darn close to each other. If I want to go forwards towards you, come here and I pull outwards. Okay, outwards. 1, 2, and really practice counting the beats. You don't have to do it out loud per se. Just think of it in your head. 1, 2. 1, 2. Even numbers are going to get you out, odd numbers are going to tangle you up more. So 1, 2. Okay? And then of course the same thing in reverse. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. And eventually, as you get comfortable with that, going back and forth, really try and and focus on taking this middle idle beat out. So if I were to go 1, 2, and then 1, 2, try going from forward straight to reverse. So 1, 2, 1, 2, and then hit back the idle. And then start from reverse and do the same vice versa. 1, 2, 1, 2, and then go back to the idle. And eventually, hopefully, after some practice, you'll get comfortable enough to go 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, which looks like this. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay. So once you get really comfortable with that, you can start working on doing different variations, such as tracers, tossing out of it, changing driving styles, such as split same versus butterfly, and things like that. And really starting to get versatile, changing planes, doing things like tracers, you know. You can also do, getting a little overzealous there. You can also do fun things like Supermans, Fantastic Fours, all that kinds of fun stuff. And there's a whole lot of literature out there on tangles and coming in and out of them. But yeah, that's kind of the basic general movement. But yeah, that's about it. That's my list. Thanks for watching. Hopefully it was helpful, and I'll see you next time.